Thank you, Judith, for reading that so well, and apologies for the fact that the reading was really long, but it's a wonderful story that's hidden away in the Old Testament, in the book of 2 Kings, that I suspect most of us don't spend all of our time in. And so this story comes to us this morning, I think, as an encouragement to faith. And that's really what I want us to be encouraged by this morning, that faith and its power to transform our lives. There are three people who display incredible faith in this story. We see the servant girl who proclaimed the hope of God. We see Naaman and his faith. He trusted in the kindness and goodness of God. And we see Elisha, who displayed the goodness of God to Naaman. So this story begins with this guy Naaman, who is powerful and well connected. We see this in the first few verses there. It says here that he was a great man in the sight of his master. He was highly regarded because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier. This is a guy who has it all together. He's probably wealthy. And he has a wife, he's got family, he's got servants. He's got it all together. His life looks from the outside to be absolutely perfect. Our passage, though, has this little line. But he had leprosy. He had everything, or it seemed like he had everything, but there was a huge but in his life. And as one of my old pastors used to say, don't we all have a but? And what the reality of that is that we all sometimes present ourselves as being in a particular way. Most of you, you just listened to Karen's testimony, and her story is one with deep brokenness in it and a lot of pain, a lot of anguish. But I suspect if you just meet Karen, that's not what you think. You see someone who's a doctor, who's married, who maybe vaguely looks like she has her life together, but underneath there's a genuine but. There's pain, there's anguish, there's sorrow. Naaman's story is so very like ours. We might not have leprosy, but we all have a but. There's something lurking underneath our lives that we need to address. And then this little servant girl comes, and we can be polite about it and call her a servant girl, but let's call her actually what she is. She's a slave. She was kidnapped from Israel by Aram, the armies of Aram, and used by Naaman as a slave in his house. And this little girl speaks in faith, and in a simple and yet extraordinary way. She says, if my master would go and see the prophet in Samaria, he would be healed. It's crazy. Now, first of all, the crazy thing is that they actually listened to the child. I'm not sure what we would do at Portobello Baptist Church if one of our children came to us with a word saying, the Lord says to do this. And I would love to think that we would automatically say, of course. And yet I know in reality that it would probably be a bit more difficult than that. I think there's a challenge in here for us to listen to our kids. And the other remarkable thing about this statement that the girl makes is that there is no evidence that Elisha had ever healed anyone of leprosy before. Or indeed, there's no evidence that Elisha ever again heals someone of leprosy. This was a simple statement of faith, not trusting that Elisha was able to heal Naaman, but actually trusting that God was able to heal Naaman. So Naaman, trusting that this little girl has said something, he goes and he seeks his healing. And he does it in the normal way. He just thinks, right, how do we do this? Well, I know, I'll go and see my boss. And then my boss will send me to see the boss of Israel, and then it'll all get fixed. But that's not what the girl said, was it? The message of the girl was if you would go and see the prophet in Samaria, not go and see the king of Aram and then the king of Israel. And this causes a huge amount of fear and confusion because when he gets to the king of Israel with the letter that has been sent by the king of Aram, the king of Israel is fearful. That's what the tearing of the robes is all about. He's mourning, he's frightened, because he realizes, the king of Israel realizes, oh, I can't heal your leprosy, and I don't know anyone else who can. And so he thinks it's a pretense. Because he's not able to fix it, Aram will go to war with Israel. And what's happened here is that the king of Israel has become so blinded by his fear that he's forgotten about God's real presence with his people. That's a challenge to us too, isn't it? Especially at this time. And this is why I think I've spoken about this passage with people as much as any other throughout this time of lockdown. Are we willing, when the circumstances press in on us, to still say that God is faithful, to remember that God promises to be with his people, to say we're not just hanging on, we're pushing forward? As somebody reminded me this week, the promise that that God will build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail is not a defensive posture. It's not one where we're just kind of hanging on and thinking, well, maybe the gates won't collapse. It's the gates of hell that won't prevail. The point is, the kingdom of God is going against the work of the enemy. We're moving forward. We're not just clinging on. And one of the great joys in this time has been to see some people who had drifted from the Lord coming back to the Lord. And I was chatting with someone just the other week whose church have baptized 19 people in the last couple of weeks since they've been allowed to do it in the ocean, because people have come to faith through lockdown, through this dreadful experience, this awful time. And yet God is at work in the midst of it. Can we keep our eyes on that? And not be like the king of Israel, who becomes so bound by fear that he's forgotten that God is present with his people. Naaman had gone to the wrong place. He went to his king and then the king of Israel. He went to the wrong person because he went to the king of Israel. Eventually, though, Elisha hears of exactly what it is that Naaman is asking for. And he steps in and he says, send him to me. And yet now we get a different side of Naaman, because what happens here is that Naaman comes to Elisha and he expects it to happen, his healing to happen in a particular way, a way that respects him, a way that says, okay, I recognize that you are this great man. He expects it to happen in a specific way, that he's just going to wave his hand over him and he'll be healed. I don't know what your church background is, and we don't do this so much in our church, but I've been in churches where there's a pattern to the way that things are done. And if we want God to move, we have to play a certain song in a certain way. And at the end of that song, we play the chords G and C for just the right amount of time. And then if we do that, and then the pastor speaks a specific set of words, then in that moment, that's when God's going to show up. And it's nonsense. And in fact, I think it's bordering on witchcraft. It's magic. It's nonsense. Because in reality, we're beginning to see if we do a set of things, then God will show up and do a particular thing. That's like pulling a big jukebox lever, not a jukebox lever, what do you call that? A fruit machine lever. If we pull the lever the right way, then all the little cherries line up in a row. It's not like that. God is not like that. And Naaman needs to learn in this story that actually God will work in a way that God will work, not in the way that he wants him to. And so the suggestion of Elisha is that Naaman should go and wash himself in the Jordan River. And Naaman is appalled at this because, frankly, the Jordan River is filthy. And he's not wrong about that. That actually the rivers he refers to are, in fact, much cleaner than the Jordan. But the point of this is not at all that the Jordan has any cleansing powers over leprosy. but that in this act of obedience and in this act of humility, in this act of surrender, God was going to meet Naaman. And then there's this fabulous little piece here where Naaman has gone away angry, and Naaman's servants come to him. And he says, my father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? In other words, if you'd been asked to do some astonishing thing in order to please God, in order to get from God what you'd been so longing for, if you've been told to climb the highest mountain, if you've been told to give away half your wealth in order to get this one thing, you would have done it. Of course you would. But this was too simple for Naaman. And do you know what? We are so often the same. We are often longing for God to do things, and yet we get stuck with wanting something grand, a big gesture. In fact, there's a song that's been a blessing to me, and I know actually to my house group over the course of lockdown. I'm trying to look up the words to it here, but it's not working. So there's a song called Highlands by one of the Hillsong bands. And there's a line in it that says that basically what it's saying is that if you'd asked me to do a great thing, to see you, to find you, to be found in you in the midst of great challenge, then I would have done that. But the line says, but you're just not that hard to find. In other words, God doesn't ask us for these grand gestures, particularly this side of the cross. All we have to do is lay ourselves down and trust that God is good. And this is exactly what Naaman discovers, that actually he just needs to lay down his personal greatness. He could have paid for his healing with anything. What he had to learn was all God wanted him to do was lay down his pride. And so too it is for us. Lay down our pride, lay down our own strengths and our abilities, and say, God, we trust you. And so he discovers that he gets a healing. He gets healed in this act of being washed in the river. And not only did he find a healing, and we could be here all day because actually the language is interesting. It begins with the fact that he wants a cleansing. That's what he wants, cleansed from this leprosy. And then the language changes and he gets a healing. But much more than the healing, he finds faith in the true God. And healing's amazing. And I've been blessed to see some people healed of crazy things through my faith journey. And it always inspires faith. But you know what? The goal of all of that is never just the healing of the individual person. It's always about, is it leading people to Jesus? Is it leading people to faith in the one true God? And that is profoundly what happens here. The one thing that Naaman wasn't looking for, he actually finds. He finds this God and he declares, it says here in verse 15, then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept the gift from your servant. He still hasn't got over the fact that he doesn't need to pay for this, but we'll come to that in a moment. This radical, powerful experience of transformation changes him. And actually, I suspect most people on this call this morning have had some sort of experience, some transformative encounter with God in their lives. It's worth telling that story, even just to yourself. Remind yourself of that story. That's why Cam's kicked off our little series of just people telling their stories. There's nothing grand about the story itself, but it's that moment of transformation. It's about stirring up in our own souls again that, oh, I remember God did this. And it's profoundly important. And it builds faith in those of us who hear it as well, which is an equally brilliant thing. And then he desires to live out this faith. And this is what we're going to finish with. See, life is complicated. Life is busy. life is challenging. For those in the workplace, life is complex. There's often lots of challenges for how do we live out our faith with integrity in the face of often really deep challenges. The Bible's not unfamiliar with that challenge. Just a little last section here that Naaman encounters. After he tries to pay for this, he says this. He says, but may the Lord forgive your servant this one thing. I'm in verse 18. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this. See, just before that, he'd been saying that he wanted to take back ground from Israel to build an altar so that he would worship the one true God. So that part, we go, yeah, that's great. The second part, he's recognizing that in his line of work, he's going to be put in a place which is ethically challenging. It's not straightforward. What should he do? He asks for forgiveness for having to do that. And what does Elisha say? Does Elisha say, no, you shall not bow before anyone else? No, you shall not live in this conflicted space. He doesn't. He says, go in peace. And I think for us, now be careful, I'm not encouraging you to compromise your faith. But what I am saying is that living in that tension, living in that space where the ethical choice is difficult, where it's not clear if you should be in that space or not, your call is to worship the one true God, like Naaman was committed to doing now, and living that out in the midst of the complexity, trusting that God is gracious, that God is forgiving, but also trusting in the wisdom that God has given you to know how you can live that out well in those places. And this, I think, is the profoundly important thing about these kinds of stories, because they're grounded in reality. They're not airy-fairy stories that exist up here that don't engage with the reality of you and I's life. We live in a moment of unbelievable complexity in the world, and we have to learn how to journey in that. And the Bible has things to say to us about that. I want to finish with this. There are three heroes of faith in this story, and they each point us to something different that we might take forward, that we might live out in the next couple of weeks. The first is the little girl who points us in faith to hope that her master's her master's challenge is not the end of the story, that there is something more. So she points us to hope, but also to courage. She spoke up. She spoke out. The second person is Naaman. And Naaman points us to trusting eventually. And I think one of the great things about Naaman's learning to trust like Naaman is it's okay to take a while to get there. Wherever you're at, if you're wondering about whether God's worthy of your trust, just keep going. Just keep going. You'll get there eventually, just like Naaman did. And Elisha, he points us to two things. First and foremost, to the goodness of God. And the second of those is to love for the outsider. Remember, Naaman was not from Israel. Naaman was their enemy. And yet, Elisha shows him the love of God. I think these three things, these three people, point us to the ways that we can live well in our complex world in the weeks ahead. May we have the courage of the child to have faith in God no matter our circumstances, and to reach out to even the powerful. May we have the wisdom of Naaman to ask for help when we are lost, and to trust when we find the answer. May we have the faithfulness of Elisha to display the goodness of God and to love outside the lines. May the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen.